The town square had never been so crowded. Dust hung in the air like smoke, stirred up by boots and horses, as if the very ground knew something momentous was about to happen. A wooden stage had been built in front of the sheriff's office, rough planks nailed together in haste. But to the people gathered it was no less than an altar. At its center stood the sheriff's daughter, pale, beautiful, her eyes shadowed with something that looked like dread. The sheriff raised his hand, his voice booming over the restless crowd. "Today, my daughter shall be given to the man who proves himself worthy. Strength, skill, and courage will decide her fate." His words cracked through the air like a gunshot, and a ripple of excitement rolled through the onlookers. Young men stepped forward, sons of ranch owners, merchants, and bankers, dressed in fine boots and polished hats. Each wore a smirk of entitlement, certain that wealth and name alone would carry them through. The crowd cheered them, shouted their names, clapped their backs. To the townsfolk, it was entertainment. To the men, it was a chance to claim beauty and status. But to the girl on the stage, it was a cage with walls made of duty and shame. And then, suddenly, the crowd parted. A figure moved through the dust, slower, quieter. A ranch hand. A man who owned nothing but his calloused hands and the strength of his back. He walked with the silence of someone who had endured more jeers than applause. Murmurs spread like wildfire, turning into laughter. Him? The poor drifter? Ain't got two nickels to rub together. How's he fit to be a husband? But the sheriff's daughter stiffened, her eyes widening. She remembered the mountains, the fall, the moment her life had nearly ended, and the rough hand that had pulled her back from death. Now that same man stood here, against all odds, daring to enter a contest where his very name was already judged worthless. The stage had been set, the rules declared, but the real battle was only beginning. The laughter did not stop when the ranch hand stepped into the square. It grew louder, sharper, cutting into him like barbed wire. Every eye turned, not with curiosity, but with scorn. Men nudged each other, women shook their heads, and even the children pointed at the dust-caked boots and the patched shirt of the man who dared to stand among the polished sons of wealth. He came to make a fool of himself. Best he knows his place, feeding cattle, not chasing brides. The words bit deep, but the rancher's face didn't change. His jaw was tight, his eyes calm, the kind of calm a man carries after years of swallowing humiliation without letting it break him. He walked with measured steps, each one echoing louder than the jeers, until he stood at the edge of the platform where the sheriff's daughter waited. And in that instant, her breath caught. She remembered the sharp drop of the cliff, the roar of wind in her ears, the terror when her foot slipped. She remembered falling, the world spinning, until a hand, his hand, caught her wrist and pulled her back from death. That moment was burned into her soul, though no one else knew it. While the crowd mocked, she saw only the truth. This man had once chosen her life over his own. The sheriff himself frowned, his mustache twitching with irritation. "You dare stand here?" His voice was thick with authority, the kind that had cowed criminals and frightened townsfolk for years. "This contest is for men who can provide, who have honor, who carry more than a shovel and a hungry belly." A ripple of cruel laughter followed, but the rancher lifted his gaze, steady, unwavering. "Honor," he said simply, "is not bought with gold." The crowd hissed, voices rising, some demanding he be thrown out before the trials even began. A few of the wealthier suitors smirked, their pride swelling. To them, the contest had just gotten easier. Why fear a man who had nothing? But the daughter's fingers clenched the edge of her dress, her knuckles white. She wanted to speak, to remind them all that this man had already proven his worth when no one was watching. But her father's glare froze her in place. The sheriff raised a hand, silencing the noise. "Let him stay," he growled. "It will make the trials all the more amusing when he fails in front of everyone." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The rancher gave no reply. His silence was heavier than any defense, heavier than the mockery thrown his way. He stepped back into line with the others, his posture firm, his eyes fixed not on the jeering faces but on the horizon, as though he could already see the storms he would have to endure. The suitors eyed him with contempt. One, dressed in a fine leather coat, leaned close and whispered where only he could hear. "You don't belong here. By the time this is done, you'll wish you never crawled out of the dirt." The rancher did not answer. He had learned long ago that words meant nothing without the strength to stand behind them. The sheriff's daughter glanced at him one last time before the trials began, her heart pounding in her chest. She prayed no one saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the silent gratitude she carried. If anyone discovered that he had once saved her life, he would be hated even more. The crowd shifted, restless, eager for spectacle. The first challenge would be announced soon. Men flexed their arms, checked their weapons, adjusted their belts. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and anticipation. And standing among them, mocked, unwanted, yet unshaken, was the one man who had already proven himself when no one was watching. The trials had not yet begun, but the real battle was already underway. The battle between what the world demanded and what true worth meant. If this part of the story gripped you, if you felt the tension in the dust-filled square, the weight of laughter turned cruel, the heartbeat of a girl who remembers the hand that saved her, then don't let it end here. Hit like to keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more Wild West tales and share this story so others can stand in that square with us, feeling the dust, the scorn, and the defiance of a man who refuses to bow. The sheriff's voice rang out across the square, silencing the laughter and mutters with a single command. The first trial, strength. A man who cannot hold the weight of this world has no right to hold the weight of a wife and family. Two deputies dragged forward a massive timber log, so heavy it left grooves in the dirt. The crowd murmured with excitement. This was no ordinary test. It was designed to break pretenders, to separate the strong from the weak. The first suitor stepped up, a banker's son in fine boots. He flexed his arms, showing off, then tried to heave the timber upward. His face turned crimson, veins bulging, but the log barely shifted. The crowd laughed, though this time the laughter was good-natured. He bowed out, embarrassed but unhurt. Next came the ranch owner's boy, thick with muscle, used to the work of his father's land. He grunted, strained, and at last lifted the timber onto his shoulders. The crowd erupted with cheers. He staggered forward a few steps before dropping it with a triumphant roar, tipping his hat to the sheriff's daughter as if victory were already his. She did not smile. One by one, the other suitors tried, some with success, some with shameful failure. Each attempt fueled the crowd's excitement, each cheer or groan rising like waves crashing against the stage. And then it was the ranch hand's turn. The murmurs started before he even moved. He'll break his back. Best stay in the dirt where he belongs. Let's see if a beggar's arms can carry more than a broom. He stepped forward without looking at them, eyes fixed on the timber lying heavy in the dust. His hands, scarred from years of rope and plow, curled around the rough wood. For a moment he just stood there, still as stone. Then, with a sharp breath, he lifted. The log rose slowly, the veins in his neck straining, muscles tightening under his worn shirt. The crowd jeered at first, expecting him to fail, but the jeers faltered as the timber climbed higher, higher, until it rested across his broad shoulders. His knees bent under the weight, but they did not buckle. His back was straight, his eyes unflinching. Gasps rippled through the square. "Impossible," someone whispered. The ranch hand began to walk. One step. The dust rose around his boots. Another step. His arms trembled, but his grip held firm, the weight of the timber pressing down like the judgment of every man watching. He walked the full length of the square, past the line where the others had stopped, until the sheriff himself called for him to lower it. When he dropped the log, the ground shook. He did not roar or boast. He simply stepped back, breathing hard, chest heaving, his face calm. For a moment, the square was silent. Then came the murmurs, different now, edged with unease instead of contempt. He did it. No tricks, no stumble. Stronger than he looks. But the loudest sound was not from the crowd. It was from the sheriff's daughter, who had drawn a sharp breath and held it, her hand pressed against her chest. She had prayed he wouldn't break, but seeing him carry the impossible reminded her of that day at the cliff. He had carried her weight then, too. Not just her body, but her life. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. He saw what the crowd did not. The way his daughter looked at this man, the way hope flickered in her face for the first time that day. And he did not like it. "Strength alone means nothing," he barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Any ox can carry wood. The next trial will show who has more than brawn. The crowd roared again, eager for more spectacle, but beneath the noise, tension thickened. The ranch hand had not just lifted a log, he had lifted himself above their mockery, if only for a moment. And in that moment, the game had changed. The other suitors clenched their jaws, pride wounded, anger smoldering. They had laughed at him once, but now they knew. This was no man to dismiss lightly. The sheriff's daughter lowered her gaze, hiding the small defiant smile that tugged at her lips. The trials were far from over, but with each step, the stakes grew higher, the risks sharper, and the air heavier with the promise that this contest would not end the way anyone expected. The sheriff's voice boomed across the square, cutting through the restless crowd like the crack of a whip. The first trial will be strength. A man who cannot shoulder the weight of work, of family, of danger, cannot shoulder the weight of my daughter's hand. A roar of approval rose from the townsfolk. They had been waiting for spectacle, for sweat and blood, for the kind of contest that made a man prove himself in the most primitive way. The sheriff gestured toward a line of heavy logs stacked near the platform. Timbers meant for bridge building, each one thick enough that two ordinary men might struggle to move it. Lift it, carry it, show this town what you're made of. The wealthiest suitor, the banker's son in his polished boots and silver-studded belt, stepped forward first. He grinned at the crowd, flexing for the women who shrieked their approval. With two helpers, he rolled a log into place, squatted low, and with a great groan, managed to lift it chest high. The crowd erupted in cheers. He staggered forward a few steps before dropping it with a thud that shook the earth, then raised his arms as if he had conquered a kingdom. Others followed, merchants' sons, ranch heirs, young men with something to prove. Some lifted with surprising power, others failed, dropping the logs too soon to the jeers of the crowd. Each effort drew shouts, laughter, wagers shouted from the back rows. Dust rose thick, sweat poured, and the sheriff's daughter stood silent on the platform, her face unreadable as her future was treated like entertainment. And then the laughter shifted, sharp and cruel. The ranch hand had stepped forward. He didn't strut. He didn't smile. He bent down, his rough hands gripping the bark of a log so wide it dwarfed the ones chosen by the others. The crowd erupted in disbelief. He's mad. He'll snap his back. Doesn't even know his place. Bet he won't lift it an inch. Even the sheriff narrowed his eyes, lips curling with disdain. This, he thought, would end the farce quickly. Let the poor fool humiliate himself in front of everyone. The rancher tightened his stance, boots pressing deep into the earth. He inhaled once, steady and sharp, then pulled. His muscles bunched, his face strained. But the log rose, inch by inch, until it balanced across his chest. The crowd went silent, the laughter dying mid-breath. He didn't stop there. Step by step, slow and deliberate, he walked forward. Every tendon in his arms burned, every nerve screamed, but his eyes never left the horizon. Dust rose around his boots, each footfall a thunderclap in the stillness of the square. He carried the log farther than any man before him, farther than even the banker's son. His knees shook, his breath came ragged, but he didn't drop it. The sheriff's daughter leaned forward, her lips parting, her pulse racing. She remembered his hands pulling her back from the cliff, the same unyielding grip that refused to let go even when death clawed at them both. That same strength now bore the weight of a log that should have crushed him. Finally, with a guttural cry, he drove forward one last step and dropped the log with a crash that sent vibrations through the ground. The sound silenced the square. For a moment, even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. The rancher straightened, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, unbroken, the dust settling around him like a crown. The silence shattered. Some cheered, voices ragged with shock. Others jeered louder, desperate to bury what they had just witnessed. The banker's son spat on the ground. Tricks. He's just a brute. Strength don't mean worth. But the sheriff's daughter's eyes never left him. She saw in him not just strength, but endurance, the kind of quiet power born from a life of hardship, of working land that never gave more than it took. The sheriff's face darkened. He couldn't deny what he had seen, but he refused to let respect show. Strength alone proves nothing, he growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the crowd. Let's see if he survives the next trial. The rancher's gaze met his for the first time. He said nothing, but his silence carried weight. It was not defiance. It was promise. The crowd buzzed again, unsettled. Something had shifted. The poor drifter they had mocked had lifted more than wood. He had lifted a question into the air, one no one dared speak aloud. If strength wasn't enough, then what was? And as the dust settled, as the sun dipped lower and shadows lengthened across the square, everyone knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, this contest would not be as simple as they had thought. The first trial was over. But the true fight had only just begun. The crowd was still murmuring in disbelief from the strength trial when the sheriff raised his hand again, his voice cutting through the noise. Strength is nothing without wit and courage. A man may carry timber, but can he carry the weight of choices when lives hang in the balance? The second trial will prove it. A hush fell. The sheriff's deputies dragged out a large wooden frame, target boards painted with red circles. Beside them came a line of bows and quivers filled with arrows. On the far side of the square, horses pawed at the dirt, their reins tied to a rail. The challenge became clear. Ride hard, shoot true, and prove you could face danger without losing your head. The banker's son stepped forward first, smirking at the crowd as if he already owned the outcome. He mounted a sleek bay horse, polished tack gleaming in the sunlight. With a sharp kick, the horse surged forward. He loosed 3 arrows in rapid succession. One struck the edge of the target, the others buried harmlessly in the dirt. The crowd still cheered, more for his name than his skill. He tipped his hat, grinning wide. Others followed, sons of merchants and ranchers, eager to prove themselves. Some struck the targets, some missed entirely. A few lost their grip on the bow as their horses jolted beneath them, drawing laughter from the crowd. Each performance drew more noise, more dust, more tension. Then the ranch hand stepped forward. The murmurs began again, sharper this time. What's he know about riding and shooting? Probably never held a bow in his life. The sheriff's lips curled in disdain. Show us, drifter. Let's see if brute strength means brains. The rancher said nothing. He walked to the roughest horse in the line, a scarred mustang with fire in its eyes. Where the other men had chosen sleek, well-trained mounts, he chose the one most likely to throw him. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some called him a fool. Others leaned forward, curious. He mounted without hesitation, settling into the saddle with the ease of a man who had spent his life astride half-wild beasts. The mustang snorted, tossing its head, but the rancher's hand on the reins was steady, unyielding. He lifted the bow, tested its weight, and then nodded once. The sheriff gave the signal. The mustang lunged forward, hooves tearing into the dirt. Dust flew. The crowd rose to its feet as the rancher leaned low, his body moving with the horse, not against it. He drew the first arrow, released. It struck dead center. A gasp rippled through the square. He drew another, loosed. Again the red heart of the target split. The third arrow came, and with it, the mustang veered sharply, nearly unseating him. The crowd roared, expecting him to fall. But the rancher clamped down, his legs gripping like iron, his body rolling with the beast. He twisted in the saddle, loosed the arrow even as the horse bucked beneath him. The arrow whistled through the air and buried itself in the final target with a thud that silenced the crowd. For a moment, there was only dust and stunned silence. The sheriff's daughter had been gripping her skirt so tightly her knuckles turned white. When the third arrow struck, she released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes shimmered, pride and fear mingling. She knew the others would dismiss it, call it luck. But she had seen the truth. Every move he made came from years of living with danger, of surviving where others would have broken. The banker's son spat on the ground, his face red with fury. Trick shot, he snarled. Anyone can get lucky once. But the sheriff's face betrayed something else. Anger, yes, but also unease. He had expected the man to fail, to fall flat in front of everyone. Instead, the ranch hand had turned the trial into proof of skill and control, qualities the sheriff could not deny. Still, he barked out, "Riding and shooting prove little. Let's see if he survives the last test of courage." The deputies brought forward something new, a narrow beam set high across two barrels, swaying slightly. Each suitor was to walk across while townsfolk hurled insults, distractions, and even objects to break their concentration. A test not just of balance, but of composure under pressure. One by one, the suitors climbed the beam. Some strutted, grinning as they crossed easily, playing to the crowd. Others wobbled, arms flailing, falling into the dirt to bursts of laughter. When the ranch hand's turn came, the crowd's jeers rose to a frenzy. They threw not just words but small stones, clods of dirt, anything to rattle him. He stepped onto the beam, his boots steady, his eyes fixed not on the end, but on the path beneath him. The sheriff's daughter watched, heart hammering. She knew this was more than balance. It was the weight of every sneer, every dismissal, every time he had been told he was nothing. And yet, step by step, he moved forward. The crowd screamed, curses flying, but he never faltered. His silence was louder than their hatred. At the final step, he paused. For the first time, he lifted his head and looked straight at the sheriff. No words, no smile, just a gaze heavy with meaning. Then he stepped down, dust rising at his boots. The square was silent, held in the grip of something it hadn't expected: respect. Not from all, not yet, but from enough to make the air shift. The sheriff's face hardened. He couldn't stop the trials, not yet, but fury simmered beneath his calm exterior. And the girl on the platform, her chest tight, her heart alight with hope and dread, knew the truth. This was no longer a contest. It was war, fought not with guns but with dignity, endurance, and a courage that refused to bend. The trial of strength had shaken them. The trial of wit and courage had changed them. And the next would decide everything. The dust from the last trial had barely settled when the sheriff stepped forward, his face carved from stone. His eyes swept across the suitors, sweat-streaked, bruised, some grinning, some scowling, and finally landed on the ranch hand. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses against a man's chest and dares him to breathe. "The final test," the sheriff declared, his voice carrying like a gunshot. "Words can be louder than bullets. Oaths bind harder than chains. A man who seeks my daughter must make his vow here, before God, before this town, and before me. But beware. False vows break like glass, and when they do, they cut deeper than any blade." The crowd roared its approval. This was the trial they had been waiting for. Not feats of muscle or skill, but a measure of heart, or at least the performance of it. One by one, the suitors stepped forward to speak. The banker's son swaggered to the front, his voice smooth as polished silver. "Sheriff," he proclaimed, "I vow to give your daughter a life of luxury. She will want for nothing. Silks, jewels, the finest home this town has ever seen. I will protect her with my wealth and honor your name above all." The crowd cheered, women sighing at the promises of riches. But the sheriff's daughter's eyes dimmed. She had heard wealth used as a weapon before. There was no heartbeat in those words, only calculation. The merchant's son followed, boasting of land, cattle, connections with powerful men. Another spoke of family pride, another of bloodlines and legacy. Each vow heavier with promises of gold and status, each one greeted with thunderous applause. And then, silence. The ranch hand stepped forward. His boots dragged dust with each step, his shirt torn from the earlier trials, sweat still streaking his brow. He looked nothing like the others. No fine hat, no silver belt buckle, no crowd waiting to cheer. Only a man standing alone, with the weight of mockery still fresh on his shoulders. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "And you? What can a drifter promise a woman like my daughter?" For a long moment, the rancher said nothing. He turned, his gaze finding hers on the platform. Her breath caught, the world narrowing to the space between them. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying further than the shouts before him. "I can't promise gold. I can't promise land or cattle. I can't even promise peace because this world has little of it left. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. But I can promise this. When she stumbles, I'll catch her. When she falls, I'll lift her. When death itself reaches for her, I'll stand in the way, even if it means I don't walk away. I don't vow it to you, Sheriff. I vow it to her. Because I've done it once before. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers shot like sparks. Once before? Heads turned, eyes darting. The sheriff's daughter pressed her hands to her mouth, her secret nearly torn open. She remembered the cliff, the fall, the calloused hand that had saved her life. His words were not empty. They were truth forged in the face of death. The banker's son snarled, stepping forward. Lies. He's a nobody. A man with nothing to his name dares to claim more worth than us? He reached for the rancher's shoulder, but the rancher turned, eyes burning like fire under the brim of his hat. One glance silenced the jeer. The sheriff's jaw clenched. His authority was slipping, the crowd divided, their loyalties shaken. Some muttered that the drifter spoke truer than all the others combined. Others hissed that a poor man had no place beside the sheriff's daughter. The tension broke when the sheriff's daughter herself stepped forward, her voice ringing across the square. He saved me. Months ago, when the canyon almost took me. He risked his life without hesitation, without reward, without witnesses. If you want to know his vow, Sheriff, he already lived it. The square exploded in noise. Shock, outrage, awe. The truth could not be stuffed back into silence. The ranch hand lowered his head slightly, not in shame, but in quiet confirmation. He had not wanted her to speak, but now that she had, the words hung in the air like judgment. The sheriff's face turned red, fury battling with something else. Fear. He could not deny the truth, not before this many eyes. He had demanded vows, and here was a vow already fulfilled. For the first time, the balance shifted. The laughter that had followed the ranch hand since he first stepped into the square was gone. In its place was tension sharp enough to cut. The crowd waited, breathless, for the verdict that would decide whether courage and sacrifice outweighed wealth and status. And as the sheriff stood frozen, the rancher met his gaze, silent, steady, unbroken. The final trial had ended, not with gold, not with glory, but with a vow carved into flesh and memory. If this moment gripped you, if the vow of a poor ranch hand against the roar of wealth made your heart pound, then ride with us. Hit like to honor the courage. Subscribe to join us for more Wild West tales, and share this story so others can feel the dust, the silence, and the defiance of men who refuse to bow. The frontier was never just a place. It was a test of what truly matters. The square had become a storm of voices, some shouting for tradition, others demanding justice. The sheriff stood rigid, torn between pride and truth, his authority crumbling in the dust. His daughter, no longer silent, stepped down from the platform and stood beside the ranch hand. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was louder than gunfire. Her hand brushed his sleeve, trembling but firm. If this town must see a choice, she said, her voice clear, then let it be mine. For the first time, the rancher looked unsettled, not by the crowd, not by the sheriff's rage, but by the quiet strength in her eyes. He hadn't fought for her love. He had fought for her right to live, and now she fought for his right to stand. The sheriff's fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice heavy with threat. But as the crowd swayed, torn between power and truth, one thing became certain. The vow had changed everything. Whether the town accepted it or turned against them, the rancher and the sheriff's daughter were no longer just players in a contest. They had become a fire, and fires always spread.